What's up guys, the Strong Boys 19 here. This is going to be my discography ranking for the third final time of one of my most favourite bands of all time, Black Sabbath. And I thought I would call this video Back to the Re-Ranking. I know that's a big change of a title from Back to the Beginning. In honour of Black Sabbath, tomorrow I would like to rank their discography as that this is maybe the permanent ranking with no more changes. Before doing this ranking, once again, I did listen to the discography for 2 weeks straight. Sometimes I've listened to some of the albums more than twice and to really think hard of where these albums have been placed, but I thought in the end, these are my most accepted and confident enough rankings of these albums. Obviously this is on the favoritism part of it, not the best. There's that difference for some of the people who want to understand this type of list. If you want to share your ranking of Black Sabbath's discography, please feel free to drop them down in the comments below. Anyway, let's get started. Number 19, this is going to be the most controversial pick to choose this album as my least favourite. Number 19 is Born Again. I do appreciate and accept a lot of the fans who cite this album as one of their top favourites or as an underrated classic. Besides that, it was not meant to be a Black Sabbath album in the first place, as Geezer Butler pointed that out. The idea was that it was going to be like a supergroup plan, with Deep Purple's Ian Gillan on lead vocals, along with the rest of the band here. But obviously, when the album was completed and recorded, the record label wanted to call it a Black Sabbath album. Whether you call this Sabbath or not, Born Again is an album that I have listened to the least. It's not just because of the terrible production and one of the worst, most awful album covers that I don't like about it. I find Ian Gillan as a lyricist to be obviously different when you think about the lyrics from Geezer to Ronnie James Dio. Some of the songwriting on this album, in my opinion, does have some of the worst lyrics. I'm not a fan of songs like Trashed and Zero the Hero and Hotline. Keep It Warm to me has always been an odd finale track to close the album. And besides that, this album does have some highlights like the instrumental Jeff Nichols keyboards piece of Stonehenge that I like a lot, involving the spacey, ambient and lengthy version of the track I do like. Disturbing the Priest and Born Again to me are my most favourites. Digital Bitch is a really good one. I just find the songwriting to be not as consistent, and I do know the whole history behind this, and I really appreciate the favouritism that a lot of fans do celebrate this album that highly. It was known as like one of the heaviest sounding albums. Ian Gillan's vocals on this album have been intensifying, demonic, and just this powerful and torturous sound. Although I do get tired from the multiple repeats of his yet amazing sounding but insane amounts of screeches through his voice. He sounds just so manic on this album. I don't mind some of the instrumentation, but this is the Black Sabbath album that I have tried multiple times to have a big connection with it. So, in a nutshell, those are the reasons why Born Again is my least favourite Black Sabbath album. There are a lot of comments of this album needing a remix. I gotta be honest here, as a remix would make this album sound a lot better. I sure will be liking it if that does happen, if Tony Iommi wanted to do it. But as an album, I don't love it. So Born Again to me is just a decent Sabbath album, even though that it was obviously not meant to be a Black Sabbath album in the first place. Number 18 is Forbidden, the most maligned and hated Black Sabbath album across many of the band's fan base. I know I should not really compare this album on the remix to the original production on Born Again, but if this album's remix didn't exist, I would still have put Born Again above this album. But for my listening pleasure and experience, I would gravitate my approachment to this album on the remix side than Born Again. Forbidden for me as an album is overhated. The returned tier lineup from that album's era did come back for the making of this album, even though the positivity was not there around Tony Iommi's experience through the whole process. Ernie C., who produced the album, still shockingly to this day defended his own way of producing. It's absolute garbage from the original version, but much thanks to both Iommi and Martin to make the remix possible. We finally do know that these are actually listenable and great songs, even though there are some weaknesses. I obviously do not like The Illusion of Power. It's not just because of Ice-T. I share my respect to him, but to hear him on guest vocals in his rapping style, it obviously does not work. Even Tony Martin said that to hear some rapping with Black Sabbath would not have worked. I think tracks like Guilty as Hell and Sick and Tired are incredibly average. There are tracks to this that I actually really like with Get a Grip, Can't Get Close Enough, Shaking Off the Chains, the ballad of I Won't Cry For You, the title track Forbidden to me is brilliant, and Kiss of Death as well. I would like to talk about my experience about the remix in a later video, but Forbidden for me as an album I have never hated. I think it is still an above average album at best, but the remix is a huge, massive improvement. Say what you say about the album, but it would never surprise me at all that many Sabbath fans would still detest this. But for those who decided to give this one a chance to really listen to what the songs sounded like in this version of the album, I would definitely say that I don't mind listening to the entirety of the album despite some of the drawbacks, especially with some of the lyrics. I find Forbidden to be, for me, a better album through the listening than the aforementioned Born Again album. So, anyways, I don't mind listening to this album in its entirety, but it's one of those albums I have always decided to give a lot of the respect for. Number 17 is going to be Seventh Star, an album that was purposefully intended to be a Tony Iommi debut solo album. I do find myself in a moment that I feel pretty bad to rank this album still as not one of the albums to be in the middle of the discography, because if it doesn't have Black Sabbath's name on it, this could have been the well-made, proper, full-on debut rock solo album if Tony Iommi's name on the front was kept. Warner Brothers decided to have the band's name on it. When Glenn Hughes heard about that, he was not happy at all. And despite he was going through these addictions of cocaine and the alcoholism, his performances on this album have been amazing. I loved his own style, and to me he adds his own distinctive tone. The voice that he showed on this album through a lot of the songs, like on In For The Kill to Danger Zone, Turn to Stone, just fantastic. I would have to say that Seventh Star, sound-wise, still is as exciting and a pretty catchy album. I never disliked the single of No Stranger to Love, so I find that this album is more like a hard rock bluesy style sounding album than a usual sounding doomier and heavier sounding Sabbath album. The production I don't mind, even though the drums to me have never been one of my favourites. The title track of 7th Star is possibly my favourite on here, and you also hear more of the keyboard contribution from Jeff Nichols. Very enjoyable one. Tony Iommi's soloing has always been a phenomenal part through his own talent. His natural, unique and blistering sounds of his solos have just been the sound of brilliance, and I really enjoyed so much of this album. If this was not included to be as a Black Sabbath album, I would have ranked this album as maybe my favourite. If this was intentionally included to be the proper debut album as separately than to call it a Black Sabbath album. 7th Star to me has very, very good amounts of material. Second half to me as not as strong as the first. I would say to anybody to not miss out on this album if they are fans of Iommi's guitar work and Glenn Hughes. Go and check out this album as it is a very, very good one. And number 16 is going to be Headless Cross. This is the best Tony Martin vocal performance in any of Sabbath's albums. Although it's obviously not my favourite, more on the favourite later on in this video, Tony Martin really shines on this album. This is arguably the most atmospheric sounding Sabbath album because of not only the very consistent themes of the occult themed Satanism, lyricism through Tony Martin's vision, but it's the sound from the drums and the guitars and once again Nichols' keyboards that makes this as a haunting sounding album. Tony Martin has been phenomenal on here, through the title track of Headless Cross to When Death Calls, a phenomenal track that features Tony Iommi's best friend Brian May with wonderful lead guitar work later on in the song, Nightwing, and my personal favourite song on here is Devil and Daughter. I do find it quite odd though that the beginning of the second side, to hear something major instrumentally after the moodier, gloomy sound from the first half, to be a bit of an off-putting moment. But Headless Cross as an album has been quite a grower album that I've grown to like a lot of it. Even with the remaster, it sounds terrific. Tony Iommi's riffing on the album sounds as inspired of an album that does sound as intriguing. Headless Cross as an album does have some stunning performances through Cozy Powell's drumming as well. His drumming on the album has been one of the other highlights on here. Grabs your attention, and the catchiness to some of the hooks that is as brilliant. Headless Cross is definitely one of those later Sabbath albums for you. Number 15 is going to be 13. I knew I would rank this album a lot higher from my previous second time of ranking the discography. I was there at the moment when I bought this album on CD at a Sainsbury's. It was an exciting time for me because this was the first time of buying a brand new Black Sabbath album in 2013. Obviously, this was the one not to have Bill Ward on the drums. Brad Wilk from Rage Against the Machine did the drums on here, and he did a brilliant, very dedicated job. It does have his own passion, and I have always appreciated Brad Wilk as a drummer, not just because of his simplicity, but it must have been something that is like you're filling in big shoes to make something as achievable and big job to come up with something that does match the purpose of making a traditional doomy heavy metal sounding Black Sabbath album. I do get it about the controversial viewing point about the production. It is as heavily compressed. The drums, the bass and the guitars are so in your face. And I know some people would say there's barely enough of the comfortable breathing space to really listen to the instrumentation of the album. But the songs themselves, to me, feature really, really good as dedicated homage type of songs. I know some fans don't like the album because of it being like the not as original and more like a boring and rehashing idea, which has been mentioned multiple times previously. But aside from that, for me, 13 to me is a very, very good album. End of the Beginning is always awesome. Loner to the zeitgeist, cozy, trippy, psyche type of track, and Dear Father I like a lot as well. I'm not a fan of some of the later tracks, and if it were me, besides that we know the deluxe edition tracks if we buy the digipack version, I would have thought that Methodemic could have been a much better fit than to include some of the later tracks like Live Forever. I would have preferred Methodemic and maybe one of the other bonus tracks to be included in the original track listing. That's just my opinion. 13 was one of my favourite albums from the last decade, and I still stand by it. Even though this was not as highly ranked anymore, I still enjoy so much of this album, and it is always as much of a privilege and the nostalgia to be in the moment, to buy this album and to see Sabbath for the first and only time in late 2013. You can't beat that. Number 14 is Cross Purposes, the second to last album for Tony Martin's contribution as Black Sabbath's vocalist. What's very interesting about this album, as I was reading the excellent biography book of Into the Void from Geezer Butler, this was never meant to be another Black Sabbath album. So another victim of an album that was made originally to be as a solo album collaborative attempt. Geezer Butler wrote quite a lot on this album, with Tony Iommi being involved. I do think this album to be as not just an album I prefer favourably than Headless Cross, but in terms of what Geezer Butler wanted to achieve, even if it was never going to be Sabbath at all, there are some awesome songs on here. Eyewitness, Crown of Thorns to Virtual Death, and Psychophobia, my favourite song on this album. There are other excellent performances, and the driving chemistry of Bobby Rondinelli's drums. He was excellent on this album. I give him, a big amount of respect here. Immaculate Deception to Back to Eden, and some of the darker tracks like The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. These are brutally underrated cuts on this album. Evil Eye, which does have a songwriting credit with the late great guitar maestro of Eddie Van Halen. I appreciate Cross Purposes so much. There's some pieces of music that is kind of like hard rocky in bits, but not too consistently. Some of the riffing from Butler and Iommi, to me, still sound as creatively inspired. Martin's voice on the album still stand out. I don't understand some of the negative criticism on this album, because while Cross Purposes has been the follow-up album to Tear and the album that came out before Forbidden, with a different lineup change obviously, I find this one to be as another one of the most underappreciated albums. Whether it was meant to be Black Sabbath or not, I would never think that Cross Purposes has been one of those middle of the road albums, because I was actually very impressed by a lot of this album, and it grew to be some of my most favourite albums through the Tony Martin period of Black Sabbath. At number 13 is Tia, the album that to me features some of the most interesting ideas through Tony Martin's own vision and imagery of lyrics. Previously, he was writing more of the continued inspirations on Satanism and hell, but Tony Iommi insisted for Martin to change that. Tia is more or less the historical Norse mythology themed album, and the artwork really shows that change of appearance after the intensity of Headless Cross. I think Tia has definitely been one of those other underappreciated later albums, like with Cross Purposes. Even though Tony Iommi's guitar work has been kind of backed off from the whole mixing stages, which is a bit underwhelming, to be honest with you, but when you hear Cozy Powell's drumming to the keyboards, they have been spreading more of the life of the whole instrumentation. The weaker track on the album is Feels Good to Me, which is a subpar ballad that doesn't really attach with what the rest of the album has been. This lineup to me deserves as much of the respect, as I find some of the songs on here to be some of my most favourite tracks in this timing period of the band, through the tracks of Anno Mundi to The Lawmaker, The Sabbath Stones, and the little medley at the second half of the album. It is, as a fantastic album, a pretty strong, close to a near perfect album. So I would give Tia so much of the admiration because of the progression of the band, not just with Tony Martin, but to move forward into creating something that, for me personally, does have an achievable amount of quality that many Sabbath fans should really discover. Number 12 is going to be maybe the biggest shocker of this album's placement on my list. Many fans would put this at the top 10 or even top 5, but I am going to push the button, drop the balls, and just address it. Number 12 is Mob Rules, the follow-up album to the majestic, gorgeous, wonderful album of Heaven and Hell. Mob Rules to me has been my least favourite in the trilogy of the Dio Sabbath albums, because it was never as a highly favourable, consistent listening Sabbath album as I do prefer the albums above this one. It is still an amazing Black Sabbath album. Production done by the late great Martin Birch, who was also famous and influential for producing a lot of Maiden's albums. The way he did this on this album, he made the whole experience of the tones and the mixing to be dirty and murky, which perfectly fits the intense atmosphere of the album, like on the tracks of the magnum opus Sign of the Southern Cross, to the loud, blistering title track and the fast-paced energy track of Turn Up the Night. Falling Off the Edge of the World is another wonderful track. Dio's vocals sounded ferocious as he adds more of his gritty tone through his vocals, and Vinny's drumming is also spectacular, continues to drive through the rhythmic simplicity, and the whole sound of the album has been like a collision through Sabbath's sound of what they've been doing best, and to have a tone that is as arguably, as heavy, if not one of the heaviest sounding Sabbath albums. But for me, as a favourable Black Sabbath album, I would just prefer the one above in my list. At number 11 is going to be Dehumanizer, the album which a lot of people would see as the least favourite with the Dio contribution. I have always been a big fan of this album, and despite some of the troubles that went down before Dio came back into the band, Tony Martin was going to be making his vocals on this album, but he was making his own experiences of becoming a solo artist, to which Tony Iommi just didn't want to keep waiting, so he had to move forward to keep working on the album. Cozy Powell was previously going to be involved, but he had his horse riding accident, so Vinny's back in the band. So basically, the Mob Rules lineup did come back for this album. The production is different, but I do love the guitar tone. It sounds menacing, the drums have been assaulted, the rhythm has just been unstoppable. I find it fascinating that the track Master of Insanity was not originally going to be a Black Sabbath track. It was intended to be a potential solo material type of instrumentation for Geezer Butler in the 90s. I find it surprising that I like this album more than Mob Rules because of the consistency of the songs. The opener, Computer God, to Buried Alive, I, and Letters from Earth, the televangelism single of TV Crimes, and my favourite track on this album is Time Machine. Dio's vocals on the album sounded just as striking and incredibly diverse. I think with Dehumanizer, to think about it as one of the other underappreciated ones, there should be a lot more enthusiastic people who would love this album or to really appreciate it so much more. Some of the people would say that this is one of the better Sabbath albums than the rest of the Tony Martin period put together, and although I would definitely appreciate that, for me, as a Tony Martin fan of Sabbath, imagine if all of this would have worked with Tony Martin's involvement, despite what went down for Iommi's choice to bring back Ronnie James Dio. But other than that, Dio to the rest of the band have made an excellent album that deserves so much of the recognition, as a lot of the songs on this album define Dio at some of his other best vocals, and for Iommi to still sound as gnarly and hungry for his own way of the riff writing originality. Alright, we are now into the top 10 part of the list. At number 10 is Never Say Die. The Black Sabbath album that took me the longest amount of time to absorb as best as I could, but when I got it, I'm actually pleased I did put this in at the top 10. Through personal struggles with addictions, Ozzy Osbourne's firing in 1979, the creative tensions between him and the rest of the band, Geezer Butler famously pointed out that this was the worst Black Sabbath album he created with the band. Now, there was one thing that I did not get for all this time before I really got to love a lot of this album: the melodic arrangements. This is nothing like as heavy or as completely like impending and destructive of musicianship. The sound of the album is, I would say, trying so hard to be ambitious. There were times on this album, on some pieces of the music, where you think it's not going to fit with the rest of the songs. Sometimes they feel abrupt. These changes happen instantly without giving some space. But when I listen to them as compositions, when I fully listened to the album and to not only hear the sound of the instrumentation, but through Ozzy's sound of vocals, to how difficult it has been, but when I really think about the music, Never Say Die is actually a near perfect album. I think while the history has been completely negative and the band being upstaged by the incredible, immensely talented, explosive Van Halen, Never Say Die's instrumentation does have so much of the boundaries that have been breaking things apart to what Sabbath used to do. The previous stuff is obviously as artistic and diverse, whereas Never Say Die sometimes does sound like a bit of a clunky misfire. But I will say this album actually contains some of my other most favourite Sabbath tracks. Air Dance to me is the highlight of the album, and I know some moments when you think about songs like this one, it may sound so unexpected and jarring. It's quite a confrontational listening experience. Don Airey's keyboards to the synthesizers, and you hear the sounds of the saxophones on the second to last track of Breakout. I actually didn't mind that track. And when you think about that track, you have to also remember that Black Sabbath, before they were signed, they used to have a member who was a saxophone player. I know that Ozzy truly hated the sound of a composition like Breakout. Well, it's not really a composition, it's like a repetitive looping jam of a guitar riff with wild screaming saxophones over the top of it and the repetitive drum beats to hearing the trumpets. But the other stuff of songs on the album, I love more and more. The title track, Junior's Eyes, Johnny Blade, and Swingin' the Chain with Bill Ward on vocals. Whether he was drunk or not doing these vocals, he was crazy vocally on that song. I would like to do a video about this album and the one that I've ranked above this. Never Say Die as an album is one I have been growing to love a lot. So Never Say Die, I can fully understand why many people would see this as a classic or some of their biggest favourable choices. This is to me one of the other highly underrated albums. Number 9 is Technical Ecstasy. I would definitely see this as one album that has been a grower, although I have always preferred this over the follow-up album. Technical Ecstasy is where the creativity of something less heavy and arguably more hard rock driven and so progressive and diverse this album really shows. This is obviously nothing like with Sabbath Bloody Sabbath or Volume 4. The experimentalism has remained so actively on this album. There has been the change of lyrics through Backstreet Kids to You Won't Change Me, and the glorious, beautiful Beatles-inspired written ballad of It's All Right with Bill Ward's amazing melodic vocal style, and I think that is another one of my favourites on the whole album, especially with the tracks of You Won't Change Me and Dirty Women being the best song on the album. Rock and Roll Doctor can be seen as like a throwaway track, and I bet Ozzy was not a fan of the lyrics. She's Gone is a ballad that I at first didn't really care for, but when I looked into the history of that one, it did make sense. It's a different type of balladry style, like when you think about Changes and Solitude. She's Gone has been a different Sabbath ballad that I actually really got to enjoy so much more. All Moving Parts Stand Still. I have something to address here. The bridge section of that track, Geezer said the lyrics had nothing to do with any connection to what most of the song's lyrics have been about. And I did not expect to know that part, because while that's more of a bluesy style of music, the bridge section has been this instant change of pace. I do find Technical Ecstasy to be one of those other albums in the discography that truly has grown on me so much that I admire the ballsiness, the attempt to make something as pretty commercial sounding. I know that Tony Iommi really wanted to be the most consistent workaholic because he wanted to get everything done for the album. He did the production on here that I think was excellent. The production is very, very good, from the guitars to the synths and the other arranged pieces of music. I think the songwriting on here feels more complete and properly structured than some from Never Say Die. Technical Ecstasy has definitely been a Sabbath album that deserves so much of the admiration. Number 8 is my favourite Tony Martin era Black Sabbath album, The Eternal Idol. The mid-1980s had been a troubling time for Iommi. The disastrous 7-star tour, especially with Glenn Hughes from his heavy drinking and the fight he had been going through, that he had to be hospitalized. Then Ray Gillen was in touch with Iommi and company to secretly replace Glenn Hughes. Ray Gillen could have been the one. He would have sounded as amazing and incredible, like with Dio and Gillen, Ian Gillan, Glenn Hughes, but he decided to step out from being Black Sabbath's vocalist soon after because he joined with a band of his own called Badlands. So Tony Iommi, understandably, did get some moments of frustration of really wanting to continue creating music and to find another potential vocalist. So Tony Martin was brought in, and it must have been completely new to fill in big shoes after what Black Sabbath had been trying to do. Well, Tony Iommi, really. And what Martin did achieve on the album is some of his best ever performances. The melodies to the harmonies, and for him to be involved with Black Sabbath in this part of the band's history, it's incredible. The Shining is my favourite Tony Martin Sabbath track ever, to the other very strong, great songs of Ancient Warrior, to the only doom sounding track of The Eternal Idol, the gorgeous, beautiful acoustic piece of Scarlet Pimpernel. The only song that is my least favourite is Born to Lose, but the rest of the album is catchy, full of memorable hooks, and despite the production on the drums to be very average for me, this album to me would have been a near perfect masterpiece. I do adore so much of what The Eternal Idol is always like. It has been a perfect introduction, and it was my first time listening to some material that is unlike the obvious eras of Ozzy and Dio. The Shining is also a song that really hits home for me for nostalgia, and I thought it was a triumphant song. I loved it the moment I heard it. The Eternal Idol is an incredible album. Number 7 is Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. I don't mind telling you guys this, that I was growing more of the addiction to this album. From the opening awesome guitar riff to the whole progression styles of it, Ozzy vocally, especially on the chorus, is immense. That erupted, demonic, heavy riff when Ozzy belts it out is spectacular. This also shows the continuation of the virtuosity of the band as artistically creative musicians. On tracks like Sabracadabra to the simplicity, keyboard effect-driven synth of Who Are You. Rick Wakeman does a bit of his own work with Black Sabbath, with his instruments, and not only that, but there are other songs like Killing Yourself to Live and Spiral Architect, which defines Sabbath to feature not only as fun sounding pieces of music, but it does feel like that it's playful. It's a playful and such a textured sounding album. I also adore the song Looking for Today. I love the rhythmic drum beat from Bill to, again, Ozzy singing, especially when he repeats the title of the song and the chorus, the exploration through acoustic guitars like on the instrumental of Fluff, which is such a delicate piece of music. Sabbath Bloody Sabbath has been as much of an exploration for the experimentalism that continues to know that Black Sabbath can deliver a lot of instrumentation that is at a very inspired peak. Even though Tony Iommi was going through a writer's block some of the time while trying to come up with some things, while a lot of the popularity of the band has been rising above and through the multiple crazy times involving addictions, but Sabbath Bloody Sabbath has a very versatile appearance, and that is what I love a lot about it. Number 6 is going to be Master of Reality, the third album, which also is as an influential monster of an album, because many of the conversations were about the tone of Iommi's riffing to the separate style of production, where it's like the growing birth of what would become like a stoner rock metal sounding album. And what I love so much of the album as a whole is with the intense imagery, not only through Sweet Leaf of the band's admiration of smoking weed, but through their views on the Christianity, on After Forever, to the destructive and apocalyptic darker sounds of Into the Void. The riffing from Iommi on After Forever and Into the Void, some of the greatest and memorable hooks the band had created. Children of the Grave is as anthemic. There's not a lot to really dive into for the album because it is just as so descriptive, but it's also one of those other heavily strong albums which does have the balance of the hooks and as well as with the melancholic nature. Solitude is my number one favourite Black Sabbath ballad. Sometimes when I listen to that track, I do find that to be pretty emotional sounding, as I did mention that on my list of the top 10 songs that make me emotional. It is just some of the most moving and yet heartfelt, personal sounding tracks. Although some would say Changes is relatable, it is as a blast of an album that is sometimes to me one album that could have been a classic for me. Somebody commented on my second time of re-ranking the discography, it may be a short Black Sabbath album, but it leaves you wanting more. And I thought that is a brilliant comment. I did not expect that. I know it is over half an hour long. I wish that both Orchid and Embryo could have been longer, but there was still a lot of the distorted and exciting magic that is this album that I have always gravitated to admire. Number 5, I had a bit of a difficult neck and neck battle of either this album or the one above. But I don't think it is that much of a risk. As much as that this is really their greatest album, and their best album for many critics to any music fan alike. I still define this as one of the top greatest albums of all time, but I'm just going to put it at this top 5 spot. Number 5 is Paranoid. Paranoid is an achievement like no other. There was no other Black Sabbath album that is always as the most talked about and documented, arguably the most popular songs on here, of War Pigs, Paranoid, and Iron Man, and Planet Caravan. Really, the first half of this album has been the most talked about first half of any Black Sabbath album. And we know they have been classics. It is as a timeless, phenomenal album, but there is still that power and strength. It's endless, unstoppable, and as important. While I do see Paranoid as a classic Sabbath album, and for classic heavy metal and hard rock all the time, as obvious it is to say it like that, it's pretty much the documented album of one of those defining moments in music history. Reached a point that it's a bit of a burnout, but it has been talked about as much, like with Sgt. Pepper's to Dark Side of the Moon. But there is always nothing that's a flaw about how much of an impactful and seminal album this album really is. Paranoid is still stunning, vicious, violent, explosive, remarkable piece of growing a genre entirely. Number 4 is the debut album. To me, this is the most important album out of the lot in the whole bunch of albums. Paranoid is the populating one. Master of Reality is the pioneering, heavier sounding album. But this debut album has been pretty much the baby out of the whole work of Black Sabbath's legacy. We did not expect to hear something as uncomfortable, spooky, and terrifying from the title track. The first 3 notes that does sound as dense and something that we did not expect. We would not know that we have been here for a ride. We've been attached to a sound that no other band has done before. It's obviously like when other bands made game-changing albums, like pioneering, artistic, big phenomenon albums of Sgt. Pepper's to popular mainstream hit albums of Thriller, and the game-changing, switching to different genres albums like with In a Silent Way. The debut album of Black Sabbath is really one of those albums. It's one of my top 10 favourite debuts of all time. The bluesy, flavoured tracks of The Wizard to Behind the Wall of Sleep, they are always just as perfect songs to me. NIB is the highlight. The Crow cover of Evil Woman, the other cover of Warning, the last track, where it's just all fun, loose, bluesy jams, and you hear Tony Iommi all on his own by himself later, where he continues to have his own rhythm and pace and improvise these licks and solos that would become as influential. The debut album is as much of a treasuring album to behold. Number 3 is Volume 4. Volume 4 is the maddening, frenetic cocaine album. Does sound all over the place and clunky, but it adds a lot of that charm. The band were so high a lot of the time, delivered cocaine boxes and even when the Rozzers were outside their doors, they would flush that powder down the toilet, and there's so much of that madness that they've continued to make that as a big inspiration for this album. The album title was originally going to be called Snowblind, but the record label decided not to agree with it because, like with Wheels of Confusion and Supernaut, Snowblind is a big reference to cocaine. I do love these songs very, very much, and Changes is one that I never had a bad issue with. At least it's so much better than the awful cover that Ozzy and his daughter did, Under the Sun, as a bludgeoning doom-style riff, is something that is as monstrous. FX, yes, is just a throwaway piece. Tony Iommi's Cross hitting the guitar strings on the fretboard, and I know that is just a bunch of nonsense, but Volume 4 does have its own character. It's a character through the over-the-top madness that the band were going through. Has been a mind fuck pretty much from the moment I heard it, because I never knew that this was an album where they would begin to increase the experimentalism of acoustic guitars and the pianos, but through the drug-fueled atmosphere. Volume 4 is such a wild but frenetic and as an investing monster of an album. Number 2 is Heaven and Hell. This is one album that gave the rebirthing moment of heavy metal, not just for the 80s, but it grew the continuing impact of why heavy metal stayed so strong all the way through its phenomenon, as Heaven and Hell is one of the best ever examples of that. Everything about the album is just straight up perfection, all of it perfect. There's no bad thing about this album at all. Ronnie James Dio's voice at some of his ultimate top best, and as well as with Martin Birch's top-notch production, creativity, the balance of the melodies and melodic vocals, the musicianship, masterclass. Not just for the popular albums of the 1980s, not just for one part in music, but of all time in music history. Neon Nights is my favourite Dio Sabbath song of all time. The other epic songs of the title track, which is as a well-deserved universal song, and Children of the Sea, to the other underrated gems on here, like with Wishing Well and the other single, Die Young, Lonely is the Word. Everything about this album needs no introduction. For anyone who knows just the title track, they will obviously discover this album and to know how majestic it always is. For an album that is 45 years old this year, it's still an outstanding piece of work. Number 1, my favourite Black Sabbath album of all time. I've talked about this album multiple times already, but I will say that this is not only my favourite in their discography, it's one of my top ever favourite albums of all time. Sabotage. Sabotage defines Black Sabbath. To me, at their biggest peak, creatively, through the production as well, the musicianship, the aggression, the progression, the precise chemistry, and everything of this album is all killer, no filler. This album defines Ozzy Osbourne at his best vocals. The sound of his insane range through the tracks of Hole in the Sky, the manic insanity of Symptom of the Universe, to his loudest, most fuck-off aggressive vocal on the Rit. The musicianship through the tracks that have been as tectonic and explosive and incredible through the songs instrumentally on Hole in the Sky, Symptom of the Universe, Megalomania, my favourite Black Sabbath song ever. Am I going insane radio? I know Ozzy and the rest of the band don't really like that song, but I don't really care. I cherish that song just as heavily. Super Tsar, the instrumental, theatrical, orchestrated vocal with the guitar. It's an awesome combination. Sabotage as an album title was obviously referencing some of the worst times when the band had been ripped off from their manager Patrick Meehan at the time and these other lawsuits. The lyrics on a lot of this album had been a direct response around that time, besides the fictional imagery, their own imaginations, like on Hole in the Sky and Symptom of the Universe. The guitar playing from Iommi has been an explosion of some of the top best ever pieces of writing here created. Bill Ward, through his speed and control, the rhythm from the whole bass work on Geezer to the experimentation with the heaviness all gelled together. Black Sabbath's Sabotage is my favourite in their whole discography, and I will always put this album at the very top spot. That is it, guys. That is my final ever album ranking of Black Sabbath's discography. Let me know what you guys think of it in the comments down below. I hope you guys will have an amazing time tomorrow. We shall celebrate a very special historical moment to conclude heavy metal with the biggest monstrous bang as possible. And we say a much needed biggest love and a thank you to Black Sabbath. Thank you guys for watching, and I will keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.